and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Kirk Hansen. I'm a senior fellow at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, an emeritus professor at Stanford, and a member of the Commonwealth Club Silicon Valley Advisory Board. It's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Rauch, author of the new book, Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Jonathan is an award-winning journalist who has written about everything from culture to government over the last 40 years. He is currently a senior fellow at the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Jonathan, welcome back to the club and congratulations on your new book. Let me start off by asking you the basic question of why an atheist, Jewish, gay individual is writing about Christianity and what it should be doing.
Like a lot of people, first of all, thank you for having me back at the Commonwealth Club. It's great to be back with you. So, like a lot of people in the politics business, I have been trying to figure out why America has become ungovernable in recent years, or close to ungovernable, why we're all getting along so poorly, so much anger and enemy and division, toxic polarization. And I came to discover that it's hard to explain all that just on the basis of, cell phones and media. You also have to look at the collapse of Christianity, especially white Protestant evangelical Christianity, and where all that energy has gone. And that turns out to be a big part of the story.
Great. Well, just to level the playing field, I am a Roman Catholic, a liberal Catholic, Pope Francis Catholic, but I have three children, one Roman Catholic, one a Presbyterian pastor, and a third a devout atheist. So I feel I've either done something right or wrong.
That's quite a spread.
One's perspective. You offer several basic charts to explain the background phenomenon of what's happening in religion. So I'd like to put those charts up on the screen.
So we have seen in the last, the last 20 or 25 years, but really just since the turn of the century, an unprecedented de-churching in the United States, like nothing we've ever seen before. And this first slide shows you what's happened. This is the percentage of Americans who say they never attend religious worship. And of course, in the US, that means Christianity primarily. And what you can see there, that red line, is people who never attend worship. And that's just about doubled to 85 million. This is almost about a 40 million person increase, which is a bigger decline of religion than all three of the historic Great Awakenings put together. If we go to the next slide, this is church membership in the US population. When I was growing up, I was born in 1960. When I was growing up, it was very common to ask people, start a conversation with, where do you go to church? Now you would just never do that, and here's why. From the time polling begins in the 1940s right through the end of the century, mild decline, but not much, the percentage of Americans who are members of a church hovers around 70%, a very substantial majority. In this century, that drops like a stone. It's now below half and continuing to fall at last check. So church-going is now a minority status. And then if you want to look at the third of these, this is what's happened to Christianity per se. This is the share of people who identify as Christian. And what you see here is the kind of dramatic drop that you just very rarely see in social trends. This is from 2007 to 2021, which is what, only 14 years. The percentage of Americans identifying as Christians drops by 15 points. That's a point a year. Kirk, that's just seismic. And where are they going? That's the other line. That's a 13 percentage point increase in the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, people with no religious affiliation. So this has been called the Great Dechurching. It's something that looks a lot like a collapse of white Protestantism in America. That's where the core of this is going on. And it's having profound consequences.
Fundamental question: why the great dechurching? Is it simply that my generation, your generation of baby boomers are more self-centered? Is it that there have been things going on in the culture that has caused that? What's the fundamental cause of all of that?
Well, can I say yes to both those causes and many others? This is what political scientists call overdetermined. There are just a lot of things that have gone on at once. There's the general decline in respect for institutions, and young people today are much less attached to institutions. You've got competition now from, cell phones and social media, and more. But a big chunk of the change, according to people who study this, are changes in the church itself. In the last century, you saw the decline of the mainline Protestant churches. These were, the United Methodists and the Episcopal Church and so on. And people said that's because those churches blended into the rest of society. They lost their cultural distinctiveness. And so people drifted away. They, weren't anchored in scripture anymore. They weren't countercultural. They didn't have a strong message of faith. And they became like consumer goods, lifestyle choices. What happened in this century is a different form of secularization, which is a politicization of the white evangelical church. It became more and more political, more and more closely aligned with the Republican Party. That accelerated in the Trump era. And that saw a rapid decline as people who were more interested in the gospel than in politics began drifting away and leaving the church. So evangelical church got smaller. And as it got smaller, it got sharper, meaning more partisan, more divisive, more politicized.
We'll go into that thesis in a moment, but let me set up the other, what I consider the foundation of your argument in this book, and that is the importance of Christianity. And you call it in your writing a load-bearing wall of democracy. Can you tell us what that means and why you think it's so important? Here you are, an atheist, saying Christianity is critical to our democracy.
Yeah, Kirk, it's kind of the last place that I thought I would wind up because I've never believed in God and I've always been a secular person. And for many years, I was one of those people who celebrated the decline of religion because I thought religion made us kind of dogmatic and ignorant and sometimes even bigoted. As a gay person, I felt the brunt of that. Mm-hmm. But a couple things happened. The first was empirical change that you just had to recognize. At exactly the same time as Christianity, white Protestantism was collapsing, all kinds of negative indicators just skyrocket. Everything from anxiety and depression to loneliness, social isolation, anomie, nihilism, and toxic polarization is a big one. And it turned out that people look for meaning in life. They look for a source of identity and values. And the things that came in as a substitute for Christianity were a lot worse at that, like the wellness movement or Soul Cycle, which don't even really pretend to confer values. And the political stuff, the wokeness, the QAnon, the hardcore MAGA stuff, which has almost a religious aspect, that's even worse because that's so divisive. So that, plus the other thing that happened to me is I started reading what the founders told us, which is they said, look, we can give you a process, a constitution, but it only works in a society with what they called Republican virtues. That's things like truthfulness and lawfulness and being well-educated civically, forbearance, all the things you need to run a republic. And they said, we can't give you that. That's got to come from civil society. And that means family and community, but it especially means religion, because religion is the main technology that we have used to anchor people in those communal values and a transcendent meaning in life. So these things go together. Once you see Christianity falling apart, it just gets harder to socialize people into the values that we all need to get along with each other.
So many of my colleagues or contemporaries born after World War II would say, "Oh, well, we've substituted different kinds of connectors. We don't have old time religion, but we are now secularists, and we have a variety of commitments to social values that undergird or should undergird our society and our democracy." Why isn't that enough?
Well, one reason is it turns out it isn't because of all the data that I just showed you. So we've got the empirical work. But I think it goes deeper than that. So look, I am very secular. I am a Jew, but also an atheist, and I live a contented life and I obey the law and I think I'm a good person. And I'm not saying that anyone who's not religious is a bad person or anything like that. But there are a couple of core questions in life that it turns out secularism is just not very good at answering. And one of those questions is, why am I here? Why does my life have meaning? Am I more than just a very short-lived blob of cells that winks into existence and winks out and has no larger meaning? The other question that it's really hard for secularism to answer is, what's the ultimate foundation for morality, for the difference between good and evil? The greatest secular thinkers and stupendous minds, Immanuel Kant, perhaps the greatest of all the philosophers, wrestled with that question. And they couldn't quite get there, but religion is able to satisfy that in people because it gives an account of the fundamental nature of morality. And it turns out that without answers to those questions, a lot of people struggle. And they turn to things that are substitutes, which are a lot less rooted in ancient wisdom, in scripture and teaching that have been refined and developed over 2,000 years for Christianity, longer for Judaism. So it turns out the substitutes are just not as good.
It's interesting. There are at least two individuals that I've worked with who have tried to develop a secular theory of values and ethics and virtue. The Dalai Lama has moved to talking about secular virtue in the last decade or so. And then a man by the name of Hans Kung, Roman Catholic theologian, did a universal declaration of human responsibility, which he attempted to define what a secular, or if you like, pan-sectarian view is. But those have not been adequate, I guess you would say, at least from the data.
So far they haven't. I'm all for making those efforts. There's a new book out by a guy named Alexander Lefebvre called Liberalism is a Way of Life. And he argues that liberalism, by which I don't mean progressive left wing, I mean traditional classical liberalism, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. He argues that is a set of values, and it does provide the maxims and foundations that we can live on. And if Christianity is failing, if it doesn't turn itself around, we're going to need those sources of values. So I'm all for working on two tracks, but even, the most simple way to put it, Kirk, is that if Christianity is out of alignment with the values of the founders and liberal democracy, if they're pulling apart in opposite directions, which is the situation right now, everything else gets harder. If those things are aligned and pointing in the right direction, everything else gets easier.
Let me go back to, you make several references to James Madison and his writings. What do you feel Madison was saying about what undergirded democracy?
Well, all the founders said, in as many words. George Washington in his farewell address, and Madison in his address to the Constitutional Ratifying Convention in Richmond, and John Adams in a very famous letter, and others all said that religion has an important part to play in upholding the values that this republic will rest on. They weren't saying, you have to be a Christian to be a good American. You have to believe in Jesus. Nothing like that. That's not the point. But the point is they're saying the Constitution is not self-sustaining. It needs to lean on these values that come from outside of itself.
Interesting. Well, let me get into the three chapters of your book, because each of them is rich in its elaboration. And you have a chapter on what you call thin Christianity, which is what's happened to the mainline churches and less influential. And then a chapter on sharp Christianity, which is your description of evangelical movement in America today. And then thirdly, thick Christianity, which is your prescription, or at least what you admire, those who exhibit a different kind of Christianity. So let's start with the first of those, which is thin Christianity. What is it and how did it come about? Why did the mainline churches lose the influence?
Well, I don't know the why. The people who study this say that it had to do with demographic changes and the fact that missionaries came back from around the world with different points of view and introduced those, and those made the church more interested in redemption by deed and not faith, and complicated stuff like that I don't understand. But thin Christianity is my name for what happens when a church stops being countercultural and just begins to blend in the culture around it, becomes a lifestyle choice. And then people start to drift away because it doesn't seem to offer them, doesn't seem to meet their spiritual needs in the same way. The mainline churches also became, to some extent, unmoored from Scripture, unmoored from the Bible per se. And some of them became politicized. They got involved in the social justice gospel, for example. So for all of those reasons, they kind of became thinned out and less able to deliver the kind of values, the kind of message that both people were looking for and that the founders expected. Sharp Christianity, that's what's happened in this century. It really starts in the 70s and 80s with the rise of the moral majority. But it takes off in a big way in the 21st century. And that's what we talked about earlier. That's when the church allows itself to get politicized, when it aligns itself very closely with one political party, when starting in 2016 and growing thereafter, it elevates the leader of that party to an almost idolatrous status. And
you, if I may, Jonathan, you also talk about the voting pattern changing in 1980, whereas in 1976, Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, was elected with a majority of the evangelical vote. But in 1980, Ronald Reagan, a Republican, was elected with the majority of the vote. What was going on then that made that a transition point?
Well, some of that was issues. Abortion became an issue. But it wasn't baked in the cake until really this century. If memory serves, I don't have the chart in front of me, but if memory serves, Bill Clinton did pretty well with evangelicals the first time he ran. It's really in this century that you get 80% of white evangelicals, sometimes 80+%, voting for the Republican presidential candidate. And more than that, you get the famous flip, possibly one of the most prominent poll results of the last 20, 30 years. In 2013, white evangelicals were the Christians in America who were most likely to say that character matters in a public officer. In 2015, they completely switch. They become the Christians who are least likely to say character matters in a public officer. What happens in 2016? Well, you get the rise of a candidate who promises Christians, if I'm elected, you will have power like you've never had before. And that's a deal that they decide to accept.
And that led them to ignore the rest of his behavior, his personal behavior?
They are his strongest cohort. It turns out if you subtract white evangelicals from the 2024 vote, Kamala Harris wins in a landslide.
Now you've characterized this sharp Christianity as an unchristian form of Christianity. In what sense do you mean that?
Well, that's important because I need to clarify because I'm sounding a little more partisan than I want to or should. So this isn't about who you vote for per se. It's not about whether you're a conservative or liberal or a Democrat or a Republican. It's whether the way you express yourself in politics, the way you present yourself and interact with other people in the civic sphere mirrors the standards that Jesus Christ sets out in the gospel. And those standards are three. Number one is don't be afraid, the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible. Number two, imitate Jesus. That means cherish the least among us, the marginal, the vulnerable. It means never treat a person as a means to an end. Every person has fundamental equal dignity. And third, forgive each other. Retribution is God's business, not ours. So that's not about your view on abortion or immigration or taxes or anything else. That's about the tone you take in civic life. And that's where, not me primarily, but the Christians I interviewed say that's where the big hole has been. The church is not, as evangelicals put it, discipling its members in bringing the teachings of Jesus into the civic realm of, politics and social media. Instead, we're seeing very unchristlike behaviors in those areas. When a political leader calls an entire class of human beings vermin, that's not something you would ordinarily expect Christians to cheer for, and yet they did.
You make the point that at some point, the sharp Christianity became a battle cry for religion, and I guess a concern about their religious liberty, that their views were not being embodied, and that therefore only a fight, a battle would suffice. Was that always there in Christianity, or do you think it really was created by Trump and others who, I guess on both sides, there was certainly within Catholicism, there were some right-wingers as well as some left-wingers who felt indeed that we had to use religion as a bludgeon on those who didn't follow our view of what religion was?
Well, fear is a basic human emotion, and it's always there. And Christians have, since the very beginning, often had to live in environments where they were not the mainstream culture, and they really had to speak out in ways that were difficult and challenging. The question becomes, Christianity is a fundamentally countercultural religion, right? Jesus Christ's model of going through life is orthogonal to everyone who had come before and probably everyone who came after. And that's just always going to be challenging. But the injunction is that the way you go about that life should not be fearful. It should reflect the calm of Jesus and fixing your attention on the next life, not on this one. What sociologists say happened in the last 20, 30 years or so is that white Protestants were the dominant tribe in America. They were the founding faith of the country, the bedrock. Any Catholic will know that for years Catholics faced discrimination. That's not true anymore. The country is diversifying. Christianity is on the decline. White Protestants are on the decline. The denominations, institutionalized Christianity is on the decline. And so it's natural for Christians to look at that and say, oh my God, look, it's terrible. We're embattled. We're in danger. It's not our country anymore. And again, the question is, okay, do you deal with that in a way that is not full of fear, but instead that is calm? Do you diagnose what's happening and try to find constructive ways to fix it? Or do you lash out with the politics of anger and division?
Well, certainly within Catholicism, the endowed chair I held at Santa Clara University was the John Courtney Murray Chair in Social Ethics. And Murray was the if you like, the prophet within the Roman Catholic Church. He was American, but he spoke to the whole church to make them less believing that they should dominate cultures and become, if you like, the state religion everywhere, and instead to teach them, as he called it, American principles of American democracy. And so there was that split within Catholicism that you describe.
Well, I look at Pope Francis and I see a figure of hope. And I firmly disagree with the church's stance on homosexuality. And I hope that someday there will be a change in that. But when I look at this Pope, I see that kind of figure of calm. I see someone who is good at keeping his eye on ministering to the poorest, the least among us, and to reminding us of our transcendent values. And agree or disagree, to me, that is a model of how to approach Christian life in the world and I guess in America.
Now, one of the, again, staying with sharp Christianity for another moment, one of the rallying cries of evangelicals is, abortion, for example, is not an optional fight. One must engage in that because there is an absolute right or wrong, and that anything we can do to gain the power and then to exercise it to end abortion is justified. Whereas, at least as I interpret the rest of your argument, there are things that are worth standing on and fighting for, and there is much more that should be negotiable, as you mentioned it several times in your book, that Christians ought to be willing to negotiate with the broader society. How does a Christian or any person of religion or any person of beliefs distinguish between those things that are worthy of battle, if you like, and those that are not?
Well, you're right, Kirk, that the fundamental idea of our Constitution is pluralism and compromise. What the Constitution is at bottom is a compromise forcing system. It says no one branch of government, no one level of government holds all the cards, that lots of different factions and interests would just have to sit down and negotiate solutions in a very diverse country. Everyone can and does and should bring their fundamental moral values to those political conversations and negotiations. But at the end of the day, what the Constitution requires of us is that we settle sometimes for less than we want, and for solutions that maybe don't get us all the way there, maybe part of the way there. And that's an approach that can be reconciled with core commitments if people just realize that they have to share the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, and your discussion of Christian nationalism reminded me of that debate within the Roman Catholic Church, which resulted in this statement written by John Courtney Murray at the Vatican Council, which was an endorsement of religious liberty and giving up the notion that we should have state religion everywhere. And I guess your sense is that Christian nationalism is a reversal of that trend of toleration and embracing that pluralism today.
Yeah, I don't talk a lot in the book about Christian nationalism because no one's even sure what it is, really. There's a million definitions. It's just a stew pot of all kinds of different things. But what it boils down to is that power and Christianity are synonymous. If you're not winning in politics, you're not a Christian. And if you're a Christian, you should be winning in politics. And there's nothing very Christ-like about that. Scholars of Christian nationalism say there's nothing Christian about it. It's just appropriating Christian symbolism for what is in fact a political movement. And it has a rising influence within the evangelical church. And one sign of that is this peculiar phenomenon that religion sociologists have discovered, which is in the same period we've been talking about, when we see all these declines in numbers of churchgoers and Christians and so on, you see that the percentage of people who identify as evangelical but never attend church has grown from negligible, like 5%, to about an eighth. about 12.5%. And those are people who are not there for the message of Jesus. They're there for because the evangelical brand has become a kind of hood ornament for a certain political orientation. So Christian nationalism gets into the mix here in this very peculiar way, but it's not terribly Christian.
Let's go to your third main section on thick Christianity, which is your prescription in some ways, although you're modest in your claim to have a prescription because of being an outsider, if you like, to Christianity. What is your definition of thick Christianity, and what does it imply about the role of Christian churches?
So thick Christianity is a type of Christianity that asks a lot of its followers and delivers a lot in return. It's the opposite, of course, of thin Christianity, which is of Christianity that just blends into the cultural background and isn't distinctive. Yet, thick Christianity at its best also coexists with our liberal democracy. So it builds a religious city, as it were, within itself that has its own values that are strongly propagated, while being at the same time being willing to share the country with other religions and other philosophies. So that's, I think, what's most consistent with the idea that the founder had, that you would have a country of these tightly knit religious communities with firm foundations, yet able to live in a politically diverse environment.
Is there a tension between being a cohesive community because you have thick ties to one another, and yet being tolerant of that pluralistic society more broadly?
I'm inclined to say, is that a trick question?
Yes.
The answer is yes, of course it is. It's very hard. It's been a tension since the beginning of our republic. And you mentioned a good example of how difficult this can be in a case like abortion. You think that 800,000 babies are being slaughtered every year. You're supposed to share the country with people who think that's okay, that's a woman's right. Yet somehow you have to do it. And that's not just theoretical. We can get into it if you want, but I found an example right here, right now, of a very thick church that is doing this very thing.
You want to tell us about your engagement or confrontation or admiration for the Church of Latter-day Saints, formerly called the Mormons?
Yeah. So this was actually one of the inspirations for this book. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as they prefer to be called, is a very thick church. It is very demanding. Like 30 to 40% of its young members go off on a 2-year mission. And most of them spend 5-6 days a week in education programs, church education programs before or after school. And they serve callings. They're called to do volunteer work. And it's a church that gives a great deal in return. The community support is just amazing. It's a very, in the United States, predominantly white church, like evangelicals, and like evangelicals, a very conservative church. Homosexuality is firmly disapproved of. It's a sin. Same-sex marriage is something that you can get excommunicated for in that church. And yet, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, under its current leadership, looked at the Bible and the teachings of Jesus and the 3 precepts that I laid out earlier: don't be afraid, imitate Jesus, and forgive each other. And they asked, so what does that imply for how we engage in civic life? And their answer to that is what they call peacemaking, which is a philosophy, as they put it, of patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. And so what's that about? Is it about giving up on your principles? The answer is absolutely not. What it's about is, when they engage in public policy, first, always a respectful tone. And second, look for ways to deconflict the situation. Look for creative ways to expand the space for people to get along. An amazing example of that, it flabbergasted me. So they're against same-sex marriage, but their church was one of the leaders in help putting through the Respect for Marriage Act in 2022, which enshrined my marriage in U.S. federal statute. Remember, they're against gay marriage, but they supported an effort that put it into law because, along with that, they got a breakthrough in recognition of religious liberty that state power will never be used to try to enforce same-sex marriage on their church or any other church, which was something that Christians were very worried about. You know, if you didn't agree to same-sex marriage, that's discrimination. You lose your tax break as a charity. You lose your contracts to do charitable work and so on. So what that does is it says this allows us to let other people live in different ways in the secular world while expanding the zone that we have to live our way. So I looked at that, I said, wow, and that's why they're in this book.
Interesting. Now, of course, sociologists would tell us that the Latter-day Saints had a very different experience of relationship to the United States and to democracy in its creation and growth than did other Christian denominations. In fact, some other Christian denominations don't even consider it Christian.
Of course, a lot don't, and that's exactly right. Their experience is very different of white Protestants, who always had a sense that they own the country. You know, it belongs to us, really. But I think for Catholics, they experienced what? It was 1960 before a Catholic was electable as president.
I was living in Houston at the time of John F. Kennedy's election. You may just have been being born, but I was living in Houston and aware of this debate between Kennedy and a group of Baptist ministers, in which they were deathly afraid that the day after Kennedy was inaugurated, the Pope would arrive to run America, and they said it that way.
I was just being born, but yeah, I'm well acquainted with that. And you know, there are lots of minority Christian faiths other than the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that have dealt with discrimination and oppression and being misunderstood. The persecution was probably worse for the LDS community than for others. But you know, this is a well-known story in Christianity, that kind of intolerance. So I don't think it's just the sociology. It's also the theology that the church is using. You know, theology matters. Churches are not just vehicles for politics or economics, and they reach deep into their scripture and their account of what happened in the Garden of Eden and their idea of what they call agency to explain why, in their view, Christians have a positive duty to allow people to make choices that they, the church, think are wrong. They don't want to enforce conformity. It's a whole theology about that. Super interesting.
The trade-off you just mentioned, allowing something like gay marriage to be enshrined in law in exchange for certain kinds of protections for religious liberty. Is that what you see as a possible solution nationally at this point in time? Perhaps addressing the church of fear, as you describe some of the evangelical churches, that they're afraid of having their religion attacked. And of course, that fear is fed by President Trump in many of his statements. But is that what we need?
And that fear is also fed by progressives on the left who say religion is no excuse for discrimination. The law is the law. There should be no exceptions. Every baker in the country, no matter how small or whatever, should be required to bake a cake for every same-sex wedding.
Yes.
Yeah, I do see that as a model. And in fact, the Respect for Marriage Act grew out of an effort that Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, among other denominations, there were other Christian groups that were involved to try to actually work out a national compromise on LGBT rights and religious liberty. So exactly that kind of effort I think it's what we need more of.
Very interesting. We have a number of good questions. I want to shift now and invite our audience to post more in the chat, but I'll start with some of these that have been raised. Question about this being a book about United States politics. Do you have any views about international politics and the role that Christianity plays in other countries? Is this relevant to Hungary, for example? Is this relevant to other places that have shown an authoritarian turn?
Well, of course, every country is different, but it is clearly relevant to a place like Hungary, where one of the things that has led to the rise of a government, an authoritarian populist government, is mobilizing fear and saying, Christians, hey, Christians, if things continue, if you don't elect me, then all your children are going to come home with sex changes, that sort of thing. And more broadly, yeah, I think so. This problem of ungovernability in democratic countries is global. In 2024, according to people who count these things, in every single election in the democratic world, the incumbent party was thrown out. We saw it, or suffered severe losses. France, Germany, United States. Why was that? Well, I think one reason is the epistemic breakdown. That's people living in fractured realities with media environments that are very partisan and isolated. And another is the global migration crisis, which is a problem affecting governments around the world that no one really knows how to deal with. But I think a third common element is the breakdown of faith, especially, but not only Christianity in a lot of these countries. Now, as some of your audience right now will be pointing out, it seemed like, a lot of countries in Europe did just fine without faith, or with less faith than in America. And that seemed to be true for a while. It doesn't seem to be true anymore. And that may be because of the stresses that growing diversity and migration and those other things are putting on those societies. And when they don't have these transcendent values to fall back on, maybe that makes it harder to cope. But that's all a little bit speculative.
And of course, there are countries abroad where the dominant culture is defined by a different religion. And interesting perspective on whether other religions, whether a traditional Judaism is getting in the way of democracy in Israel or so on.
Yeah, so that's a whole separate conversation. I should mention that I focus in this book. This is a book about Christianity, and it addresses Christians. It's specifically about white Protestant Christianity, and that's because that's where the crisis is in America right now. And you hunt where the ducks are if you're in my business, which is trying to figure out how to solve problems.
There's a couple of questions about what is going on. What are the changes going on within Christianity itself in the mainline Protestant churches, in Catholicism, in other branches of Christianity? Are there hopeful signs you see that lead you to believe that thickening Christianity is occurring and is possible?
It's a mixed bag, Kirk. I did not do research on the Catholic Church for this book, so I can't really speak to that, or for that matter, the ecumenical church. What we're hearing anecdotally, though I'm not seeing it in poll results at this point, what we're hearing anecdotally is that Gen Z, younger people, are becoming more interested in Christianity and in religion, and becoming more receptive and curious about the teachings of Jesus, and starting to look for ways to re-engage with it. But it appears that this engagement won't be their grandfathers or great-grandmothers type of engagement, the big mega church with the rock band and the projections, or the cathedral on Fifth Avenue where everyone is silent and solemn. It's going to be a more personalized kind of Christianity, more customized, perhaps more focused on the teachings of Jesus and Scripture and applying those in life. I'm not sure yet we know the outcome to that. And I think actually, it's really in a way why I wrote this book, a lot depends on the comportment and the decisions of Christians. If they continue on the path, white evangelicals, that they've been on, of becoming smaller and sharper and more politicized and partisan, the pastors hate it. One poll found that over 40% of pastors said they had seriously considered quitting in the past year. And I asked that question to pastors I interviewed, and they said, heck yes. One said only 4 times. They want to be there to pastor people toward the teachings of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
When they come in on a Monday morning after giving a Christ-like sermon, they open their inbox and they're hit with these emails about, we're in danger. What are we doing to fight back? What one pastor called a battlefield mindset. So the question becomes, if the church can begin to reorient itself in the directions of the teachings of Jesus that we've talked about, will that become more attractive than going down the partisan, politicized route that it has? I think the answer is yes, because the historical example, you know this better than anyone. In 2,000 years, Christianity has often been at its best when it's been at its weakest. Mm-hmm. At those moments when it's had to look inward, rediscover its values, go out into the world with a missionary sense, not that the country belongs to us, we need to keep it and fight. But no, the country belongs to God and it's not there yet. We need to demonstrate Christ-like virtues and be a shining countercultural model. That's when Christianity's at its best. And maybe that would work. You tell me.
Just to back up your notion that there are some interesting, lots of interesting experiments in Christianity today. My daughter does research on the feminist movement in the evangelical churches. She's herself a pastor, but she's written on how there are growing communities of women leading online communities of evangelicals to a different kind of a philosophy.
Yeah, I was just this morning, as it happens, playing a podcast, an interview with a pastor who's a founder of what's called Shift Church, SHIFT. I think they're in Florida mainly, but they're a confederation of small churches of people who have no longer feel they have a home in the evangelical church, but have not given up their evangelical beliefs. Mm-hmm. And so they're starting this small network. He says it's difficult and it's small, but they're growing. Russell Moore, who's the editor of Christianity Today, says that the way this works itself out, if Christianity can recover from the road that it's been on, would not be some big apocalyptic battle between, the Church of MAGA, the Church of anti-MAGA, duking it out for supremacy. That it will be people voting with their feet away from the MAGA church, as has been happening, and grassroots change as newer and younger generations of parishioners come in, as a different group of pastors begins to form. You'll see this, they say, in church plantings and in these kinds of small churches that you're just talking about. And in the small groups, which are how evangelicals do their work of socializing into the message of Jesus, those are the Bible studies and so on. He says it's going to be kind of bubbling up from the ground if it happens.
The question's asked, how is that expressed in support for democracy, these changes that you're describing and these hopeful shoots you're describing? Are there hopeful shoots not just in the way the religions are behaving, but in how they're engaging with democracy?
Such a important question. So the core of my book is an insight on this, which I will now share with you. And here it is. This is my big message. The message of Jesus Christ is much, much closer to the message of James Madison than to MAGA, because each of those 3 core pillars of Christianity that we talked about, don't be afraid, imitate Jesus, and forgive each other, maps very directly onto the values that the founders of our republic wanted us to have. Don't be afraid matches up with, sometimes you lose an election. You can't always win. It's not the end of the world. Mm-hmm. Don't be fearful. Have some trust and faith in the republic, and that you will grow and learn from this and come back stronger than ever. Imitate Jesus maps onto fundamental commitment in our country to minority rights. That's in the Constitution, the least of these. You cannot do things to people without due process of law. That's always treat people as ends in themselves, never as means. So the third is forgive each other. And that basically says sometimes you win an election. Don't try to drive your opponent out of the country. Don't try to crush them, drink their tears, salt their soil. It's your obligation as a civic democrat to treat the losing side, if it's the other side, the way that you want them to treat you when the tables turn. And so what I'm saying is that all of the materials that are needed for Christianity to become a healing force in our country that strengthens democracy and strengthens the church is to emphasize those elements of its own teaching that are core to its teaching and also support our democracy. I'm just asking for Christianity to be not more democratic or Republican or left-wing or right-wing. I just want it to be more Christian. And so my answer to that question, sorry about the long wind-up, is
No, it's,
yes.
it's very important. This is your bottom line.
This is my bottom line. Yes, there is a huge amount that Christianity can do to heal our democracy just by modeling the virtues of Jesus in our civic life.
Let me pick up a few of the other questions here. We still have 10 minutes, and we can get to several of these. There are a couple of questions about the role of the media, the role of social media in this evolution of Christianity, both the weakening of thin Christianity and the development of sharp Christianity. What's your sense about the importance of that, and whether there's any reversing the divisive influence of the media?
Well, that question could be taken a few different directions. One is social media and new technology and all that. And that's been a disruptive force everywhere. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, that's put a lot of strain on society that has made it more important, not less, that people have community anchors like organized religion. Something that goes deeper and is more lasting than just looking at their cell phone. The other direction to take the media question is, has the media done enough to understand and cover and highlight the importance of faith in our country? And as a card-carrying member of the mainstream media, the answer is no. We have not. Many newspapers, you remember newspapers, they were like, big paper things that got ink on your hands. They had a religion page, and it ran on Sunday and it had church news and stuff. But the main coverage, the political coverage and the economic and social coverage almost never touched on religion. And today, newsrooms are very, very secular. It's not to say there aren't Christians there, but like a lot of workplaces in and outside of media, a lot of Christians kind of keep their faith to themselves. I'm not saying they're oppressed or that, war on Christmas, none of that. I'm just saying that secular America kind of lost sight of the importance of faith to so many Americans, and it showed in our coverage. It alienated a lot of people. I think it helped elect Donald Trump, among other things. And it's also a disservice to our audiences, who deserve to know more about these fundamentally important institutions. So one of the things I do in the book is call on people like me to really onboard a better understanding of religion and integrate it into our coverage.
Couple of questions here which ask whether, if they're not Christian, our viewers, or if they're simply interested in the secular movement in the United States, are there expressions of secularism that adopt the principles that you hope Christians return to?
Oh,
are there secular movements that you look to that give you hope about the ability to support Madisonian democracy?
Absolutely. I'll tell you about one that I happen to have been a founding board member of. Now I'm just an evangelist, and that's Braver Angels, which is a national grassroots depolarizing movement that's based on the principle of people across the political divide not finding common ground on issues, but relearning how to listen to each other. That's so important, and we've lost that. Many people don't even want to talk to someone on the other side. And when they do, through a Braver Angels program like our workshops and our Braver Angels debates, the most common reaction they have is, we're not as divided as we'd been led to believe. And that, by the way, is provably true. Survey evidence show that people exaggerate by a factor of 2 how much the other side disagrees with them or dislikes them. And just showing people that that's the case, that they're not as divided as they've been led to believe, by itself decreases the amount of polarization and fear, at least for a while. So that's one example of the movement of that kind, but there are many others, and there are more than one in your community.
That gives that for you as a secular person to approach and get engaged in.
Yes, absolutely. Now, of course, people of faith are also more than welcome.
One person says, you follow the research on religion quite closely, obviously. As you've read that research over the last few years, what's the biggest surprise, or what are the surprising trends, besides those you've described in the book, that you draw our attention to? And what sources, it asks, do you look at for this ongoing research on religion?
Well, I wish I had a clever answer, but the truth is the biggest surprise for me has simply been the rate of dechurching in America and the rate of the decline of the Southern Baptist Convention. They're just bleeding members at a rate that I just wouldn't have thought would be possible or likely, and that's an ongoing surprise to me. There's lots of good religious demographers. I would point people to 2 places first. One is the Public Religion Research Institute, which is run by a guy named Robbie Jones, absolutely first-rate guy. He himself is a Christian. And the second is the country's leading religious demographer, whose name is Ryan Burge, Burge. He's a pastor and also a professional sociologist or demographer. And he runs a Substack that's just indispensable. It's called Graphs About Religion, and it's exactly what it sounds like, deep dives into the data. And if anyone goes to both those places, they will come away with all kinds of rich understanding and data.
As a final question, I want to put you in the shoes of the newly appointed Catholic Cardinal of Washington, D.C.
Oh, no. Please don't.
The Episcopal Bishop, Marianne, I think it's pronounced Buddy, gained a lot of criticism amongst the right wing for her mention of mercy in the presence of Donald Trump on Inauguration Day in the National Cathedral. Well, so Pope Francis appointed a new cardinal to head the Archdiocese of Washington, Robert McElroy. And McElroy will be installed on, I believe it's something like March 10th, anyway, early in March. And he will give an address. He is a very sophisticated observer. You would enjoy greatly talking with him. He's a PhD in political science and has a doctorate in theology as well. But he has been the spokesperson for the liberals amongst the bishops in the Catholic Church for the last 10 years. And so the Pope very strategically transferred him from San Diego to Washington, D.C., right at the beginning of the Trump administration. What should a Christian say, given this particular context, as he introduces himself to both his Catholic constituency, but also as a spokesperson for religion in some ways in the United States?
Well, even for me, Kirk, that is presumptuous of me to say, but you asked, so I will answer. I'll also try to get you to commit right here on this show to giving me an introduction to Cardinal McElroy. I would love to meet him. Nothing would be a higher honor. So what I would suggest that he say is, first, don't be afraid. Second, imitate Jesus. And third, forgive each other. I think that's the message that the country needs to hear from Christians right now. My other piece of advice for what he could do is take 3 days, go to Salt Lake City, and sit down with the top leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You will find a mindset that is refreshing and different and deeply thoughtful.
We'll be looking for a senior position in Christianity to name you to, Jonathan, so that you can carry that message further. Thank you very much. We are grateful to Jonathan Rauch, author of Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, for being with us. We hope that you viewers will support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible by becoming a member. For more information, visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Kirk Hansen. Thank you and take care.